There is a language spoken in the middle of Europe that does not belong there. Surrounded by Slavic tongues to the north and east, Germanic to the west, Romance to the south, it sits alone, untranslatable, unrelated, out of place. That language is Hungarian, and for centuries, the names carried by its speakers were treated as simple labels, inherited, unremarkable, ordinary. Then genetics started listening to them differently. Some Hungarian surnames are common. Nagy, You hear them everywhere, and their origins are plain enough. A big man, a smith, a Slav, a Croat. But scattered through the historical record are rarer names, older names, ones that do not resolve so easily into occupation or geography. Names that seem to reach backward, past the kingdom, past the Christian conversion, into something else entirely. A handful of researchers began asking a strange question. What if certain rare surnames are not just words, but signals? What if, embedded in a family name passed down for 1,000 years, there is a thread that DNA can actually trace? This is the story of what happened when they looked. To understand why this mattery, you have to understand what the Hungarians were supposed to be, according to the story most people grew up with. In the late 9th century, a confederation of horse-riding tribes crossed the Carpathian passes and settled the Great Basin of the Middle Danube. They called themselves Magyars. Historians linked their language to the Uralic family, a group stretching east toward the Ob River in Siberia, with distant cousins in Finnish and the small Ob-Ugric languages of western Siberia. The implication seems straightforward. The Magyars were a steppe people from deep in the Eurasian interior who rode west, conquered a basin, and became Hungary. For a long time, this was treated as settled. Linguists had traced the vocabulary. Chroniclers had recorded the conquest. Oral tradition, later folded into medieval writing, spoke of 7 tribes and a leader named Arpid. The story had a beginning, a middle, and a comfortable resolution. Nomads from the east, a new home in the west, a nation born. But there was a problem, and it had been sitting there for a long time, mostly ignored. The problem was the body. Hungarians do not look, on average, distinctly different from their Slavic and Germanic neighbors. There was no obvious physical signature of a steppe Siberian population having simply replaced everyone in the Carpathian Basin. Skeletal studies from conquest-era cemeteries showed a mixed picture. Some individuals with skull shapes and burial goods that matched the eastern steppe world. Others that looked more like the pre-existing local population. If the Magyars had arrived as a unified, biologically distinct group and simply taken over, the archaeology should have been cleaner. It wasn't. Something had already been blended before the history books were written. That is where the first real friction begins. Not a contradiction exactly, but a signal that did not fit the tidy version of the story. Then came the tool that could ask the question archaeology couldn't answer alone. The genome. When researchers began extracting ancient DNA from conquest period burials, the graves of the men and women who lived through the 9th and 10th centuries in the Carpathian Basin, they were not just measuring skull shapes anymore. They were reading mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through the maternal line, and Y chromosome DNA, passed only from father to son. Together, these 2 lines of evidence work like 2 separate witnesses to the same event. When they agree, the story is simple. When they disagree, something more complicated happened. A demographic event, not a myth. And in the Hungarian case, they did not fully agree. The male lineages recovered from elite conquest-era burials showed a notable presence of Y chromosome types associated with deep Central Asian and Southern Siberian ancestry, types that are rare or absent in most of modern Europe, but common along corridors of the Eurasian steppe. This was, for the steppe warrior narrative, a moment of vindication. Here was direct biological evidence that at least part of the founding population had ancestral roots far to the east. But the maternal lineages told a more tangled story. Many of the women's mitochondrial signatures matched populations already established in Europe, meaning that from very early on, incoming steppe men were having children with local European women. This is not a contradiction of the migration. It is something more interesting. Evidence that the Magyar conquest was, from its first generation, already a mixture. Not a wave that replaced a landscape. A wave that merged with it immediately. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence keeps rewriting the map, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most origin stories admit. Once researchers accepted that the founding population was mixed rather than uniform, they were left with a harder and more interesting question. Mixed with what, exactly, and when? 3 explanations rose to the surface, and for years, none of them could be fully ruled out. The first was straightforward admixture during the conquest itself, steppe men marrying or taking local Carpathian Basin women as the Confederation settled, diluting the Eastern genetic signal within a generation or two while the language and elite identity remained intact. The second was a ghost population scenario, the idea that the Magyars who arrived in the 9th century were themselves already a blend, having absorbed Iranian-speaking, Turkic-speaking, and other steppe neighbors over centuries of movement across the Pontic and Ural steppe before ever reaching the Danube. Under this model, the mixture happened long before the conquest, somewhere on the road. The third, and the most unsettling for the traditional narrative, was cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the possibility that the Magyar identity itself may have spread partly through language and political dominance rather than sheer population replacement, meaning some communities became linguistically and culturally Hungarian while remaining largely descended from people who were already living in the Carpathian Basin before the conquest ever happened. Each explanation implies a different kind of history. One is a migration story. One is a steppe crossroads story. One is closer to a story about identity itself, about how a people can be forged as much through language and belonging as through bloodline. This is where the surname evidence becomes unexpectedly powerful. Rare Hungarian surnames, not the common occupational ones, but names like Orsi, Kaber, Bees, Turk, Szekely-linked family names, or names built on old tribal and clan roots such as Kur, Kesi, Tarjan, and Gino, are not random. Several of them echo the names of the original tribal confederation that historical chronicles claimed made up the conquering Magyars. When genetic genealogists began recruiting men who carried these rare surnames and sequencing their Y chromosomes, they were essentially testing whether a name preserved through 1,000 years of patrilineal inheritance still carried the biological signature that history had attached to it. The results were not uniform, and that in itself is telling. Some men with names tied to the old tribal structure carried Y-DNA haplogroups consistent with deep steppe and Central Asian ancestry, a plausible unbroken paternal line stretching back toward the founding warriors. Others, carrying names with the same historical prestige, showed haplogroups common in Western and Central Europe, suggesting that at some point their male line was not biologically Magyar at all, perhaps an adopted son, a shifted allegiance, an unrecorded break in a family tree that documents alone could never reveal. Not every surname told the story its bearers expected. The landmark moment came when a broader ancient genome comparison, pulling together conquest-era burials, earlier Iron Age populations from the Carpathian Basin, and comparative data from the Ural and Western Siberian region where Hungarians' closest linguistic relatives still live, was assembled at a scale earlier studies could not match. This was not a handful of skeletons anymore. It was a population-level comparison, spanning centuries and thousands of kilometers. And what it revealed reordered the picture again. The closest genetic matches to the elite conquest-era burials were not, primarily, the modern Hungarian-speaking populations of the Volga-Ural region who share Hungarians' linguistic cousins. They were, instead, a patchwork, pulling threads from Xiongnu-era and early medieval steppe populations, from communities associated with Turkic-speaking polities, and from groups with Uralic-linked ancestry all folded together. The genome was not describing one point of origin. It was describing a long, layered corridor of contact stretching across the steppe, absorbed piece by piece, centuries before the conquest of the Danube Basin ever happened. Not the population researchers expected. Not even the single region they expected. The twist was not that Hungarians turned out to be something other than what the old story claimed. The twist was that the Magyar identity itself, the language, the tribal names, the founding myth, had been carried by a population whose genome was already a mosaic long before it crossed into Europe. The genome was not erasing the old conquest story. It was revealing an older, wider story underneath it, one where language and biology had already parted ways on the steppe, centuries before Arpid's people ever saw the Danube. This matters far beyond Hungary. It is easy, looking at any nation, to imagine a clean line running backward. One people, one land, one continuous thread. DNA keeps showing that this is almost never how human history actually worked. Populations are not pure streams flowing from a single source. They are deltas, dozens of tributaries merging, separating, and merging again, long before anyone wrote down a name for the river. Picture the Carpathian Basin in late autumn, 13 centuries ago. Mist settling over reed marshes along the Tisza. Horses moving through tall grass under a sky the color of iron. A camp of felt tents and cattle, voices speaking a language unrelated to anything for 1,000 miles in any direction, and beside them, villages of farmers who had lived in that same basin for generations, watching the newcomers arrive, intermarry, argue, trade, and eventually share a single evolving identity. Two rivers of human history meeting in one valley, and from that meeting, a nation slowly took its name, a name that would outlast every person who was there to give it. That is what a rare surname can preserve. Not a pure bloodline. A memory, imperfect, partial, occasionally wrong, of a moment when a family attached itself to a story larger than any one ancestor could have lived alone. If a genetic test tells someone their Y chromosome does not match the step signature their surname implies, that does not make their Hungarian identity less real. It makes it more human. Because identity was never only about biology. It was about the choice, generation after generation, to keep speaking the language, keep the name, keep belonging to the story, regardless of what any single strand of DNA could prove or disprove. So when you look at a name like Kerr, or Bees, or Turk, understand that you are not looking at a fossil. You are looking at the visible edge of something much larger and mostly invisible. 1,000 years of movement, mixture, loyalty, and reinvention, compressed into a handful of syllables that a family decided, generation after generation, to keep. The old story said the Magyars came from the east and became Hungary. The genome agrees with that story, and then quietly insists that it was never that simple. The steppe itself was never one people. The basin they settled was never empty. And the names that survived are not proof of purity. They are proof of persistence, of a story that refused to stay small, no matter how many rivers had to merge to carry it forward. If stories like this interest you, where a single name or a single strand of DNA turns out to hold centuries of hidden history, subscribe, because the human past is far more layered than any map has ever managed to show. The map of who the Hungarians are was never finished. It still isn't. And maybe that is the truest thing DNA has ever revealed about any people. The origin story is never really an ending. It is only the oldest layer we have found so far.